focus on the last paragraph, the Rambam's sequel to the Minyan HaMitzvah Kotzer. It says, Eluheim Sheish Me'ois U'Shlosh Asrei Mitzvah Shneimah Moshe B'Sinai Heim V'Kol Poteseim V'Titukeim V'Chulei. Then he says, V'yesh mitzvos acheros s'nischatchu achamatan Torah v'kovu oison neviim v'chachomim u'poshu b'chol Yisrael. The new mitzvahs k'goyin Mikul Megillah v'nei Chanukah v'sa'anis Tisha B'Av v'yodayim v'eruvim. So I mentioned this once when the Rav was learning with us the first Shoresh. The Rambam is dealing with the halachas gedolos, who counts in his Minyan HaMitzvos Mikul Megillah Ner Chanukah. The Rambam asks, if you're going to count Mikul Megillah Ner Chanukah, you should also count Yodayim and Eruvim. And the Rav said the pshat is that he can imagine, the Rambam can imagine that new mitzvahs, which have no precedent, which are not a siyog, which are not based on a mitzvah d'oraisa, maybe they could have been a mitzvah, minyan mitzvah, because they're new. Okay? If l'moshel you have on Shabbos, you have Shvus, which are Mlocha d'Rabbanon, they certainly wouldn't be new mitzvah minyan mitzvahs. However, Yodayim and Eruvin, they're not based on anything. Yodayim is a new type of tumah, a new chiyuv netila, and Eruvin is also a new takana. It's not kilu midrabanon that it's a midrabanon. It's sorabim with an Eruvin, and the Rav used to bring a raya the matzil and kisvei hakodesh. If you have the proper mechitzas and a lechi, whatever. But however, if you're missing an eruv, you can still be matzil. But without a lechi, you can't be matzil, because lechi, the isa hoitzah to chotz shenim mureves is not an isa malacha d'Rabbanan. It's a separate isa, and therefore could have been a separate mitzvah. What the Rambam adds over here is something new. That Tainis Tisha B'Av is also a new mitzvah with no precedent. And the same way that if you would count Mikul Megillah and Ner Chanukah as a new mitzvah, and you would count Yodayim and Eruvin as a new mitzvah, you should count also Tainis Tisha B'Av. And that's something new. He didn't mention this in Shoresh Aleph. There's a new mitzvah called Tainis Tisha B'Av. And we just don't count it in Minyan mitzvahs. We don't count mitzvah Rabban even though they're new. But the Rambam says that Taigi mitzvah Nemel Moshe B'Sinai, and it has to be Nemel Moshe B'Sinai. The Rabbanans are not included. Now, this premise that Tisha B'Av is a new mitzvah is not clear at all. Because you open up Hilchos Tainiyos, a halacha aleph, beis, and dalet, mitzvah seimin ha-Torah, liz'ek l'oriyah b'chatzreitz al kol tzor shetovoy, shenemar atzar atzoreschem v'hareisem, kloimar al dovo she'yitza lachem, if there's an eis sorah, k'gon batzeres, v'deva v'arba kiyetz behen, za'aku aleim v'oriyah. You should be za'aku b'peh, and oriyah with the chatzaitzos. It's part of the institution of tshuva. It's a separate mitzvah from tshuva, but it's a prelude, as the Rav said, to tshuva. Shebizman shetovo tzora bizaku, the za'aka will lead man to be introspective. V'yuriu, yedo hakol sheb'gral ma'aseh maroim hu alehem. Kakosu of the same, v'zehu sheyigum lehem l'hoseh atzom elehem, because of the tshuva. Then halacha dalet b'tuvei sofrim lis'anes al kol tzor shetov al hatzibur. Tanis is an extension of za'aka. Tanis, which Bezdin Agoizer, Be'ez Sora, is an extension of the concept of za'aka. Lis'anos hakol tzor shetovo ha'atzibur ad shiruchu min hashamayim. In fact, in one Maria Shir, the Rav said that he heard from his uncle that the Zayda Rab Chaim had a certain opinion, and it starts like this. The Chafetz Chaim sent around the Kol Koreh, and he wanted to be Geizer Tainis towards the end of the First World War, and because it's an Eisor. And he said that he heard from his uncle that the Zayda Rab Chaim was against it. Because the purpose of Tainis is an extension, this whole is Zehu Shegurim Lehem Lo'aseh Atzorim Elehem. With the B'Seifrim, this Anos HaKol Tzor Shetovoi, Ad Shiruch Min HaShemayim, because you're going to do tshuva. We may a tiny Yisraelu Zokim B'Tfilois U'Mischanen Morian B'Chatzoises Bilvad. And Rab Chaim held that if there will be Geizer Tainis and they won't do tshuva, Ki'ilu is a tain on Klal Yisrael, and Rab Chaim was against it. But whatever it is the tainis is an extension of the whole concept of Zaka. It's not a new mitzvah. And the Ram says in Perek Hey of Hilchos Tainiyos, Perek Hey Halacha Aleph and Gimel, Yeshom Yomim Shekol Yisrael Misanin Bohem V'nei Atzor She'iru Bohem. Also, the tiniest, the historical, the zikon l'ma'aseinu aloyim u'ma'aseinu l'seinu shehoye k'ma'aseinu ato ad shegom lehem v'lon ois and atzoros. Will recall what they did and what we are doing. Shebezichroin dvorim elu noshuv lehetiv. So in a simple English, the purpose of these fast days is very similar to the fast days which Bezdin is Geizer, and the purpose of the Tainis, the purpose of these fast days are as a prelude to Tshuva. And he says, the Tisha B'Av, skipping to Halacha Gimel, B'Tisha B'Av, V'chamish Dvorim Iru Boi, V'nigza Al Yisrael B'Midbar B'Chulei, and this was also one of the tiniyos which they were geizer as a prelude to tshuva. So l'cheira, it's clear and crystal clear that these tiniyos are extension of the mitzvah of za'aka. So a priori, we shouldn't look at Tainis Tisha B'Av as a new mitzvah, but we should look at it as we understand that it's an extension of the mitzvah za'aka. So the question is, what did the Rambam want over here at the end of his epilogue to Minyan HaKotzer? So there are two options. The first one I'm sure about, the second one maybe, I don't know. The first one is that the Rambam in general, Minyan HaKotzer, works with his approach in Minyan HaMitzvos, and here we see it also. And this discussion over here is a prelude, is an epilogue to the Minyan HaKotzer, and in many ways, the Minyan HaKotzer, this introduction to Mishnah Torah is really an epilogue to Sefer HaMitzvos and not necessarily a prologue to Mishnah Torah. And you'll find many stiras between Mishnah Torah and Minyan HaKotzer, and here's one of them. Because the mitzvah, mitzvah nuntes, in Minyan HaKotzer, is Liskoya B'chatzeitzos ala Korbanos u'B'shas Hatzoros, Shnema uskatem B'chatzeitzos. The mitzvah of Chatzeitzos in Sefer Mitzvahs is Chol Del Gamre. It's a mitzvah of Tkiyas Chatzeitzos, and it's both on Korban and B'shas Tainis. It's nothing to do with Zaka. It's therefore, since it's nothing to do with Zaka, and Korban has nothing to do with Zaka, it's just a Tkiyas Chatzeitzos. The mitzvah Chatzeitzos on Korban and in Tainis is one mitzvah. Then Zaka has nothing to do with the mitzvah of Chatzeitzos. He says it very clearly, also in Minyan HaMitzvos, in Mitzvah Ayin Nuntes, a Mitzvah Nuntes, he should see Liskoya B'chatzeitzos, B'mikdash, Im HaKovas Kol Korban, Mikorban HaMoadim, V'omo Yis'ale, V'yom Simchaschem Moadeichem Moshech Oseiros Chatzim, Uskatem B'chatzeitzos. And then Ubei Omu Shemitzvah Yom B'chatzeitzos is referring to the Chatzeitzos of Tainis, Ekva Yisboya, then he's V'chein Anachnu Mitzuvim, Liskoya B'chatzeitzos, B'itas HaTzoch, B'atzos, Kishenizak. The Nizak is not part of the mitzvah, it's just the time when we do the Chatzeitzos. Lifnei Hashem. Shenizak Lifnei Hashem Yisal, V'omo Yisal V'chizavo V'muchomo, V'yatzcham Atzal Tzorescha. So once you're ready to accept what he says in Minyan HaKotzer and Minyan HaMitzvos, that the Chatzeitzos is just a mitzvah of Tkiyas Chatzeitzos, and there's no mitzvah of Za'aka, so then the relationship of Ta'anis, or the relationship of Tshuva to the mitzvah of Chatzeitzos is non-existent. Because the mitzvah is Tkiyas Chatzeitzos. It just happened to be one of the times that you take care is when you say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if that's the case, then Tainis Tisha B'Av could certainly be a new mitzvah with no precedent in the Torah, and therefore the Rambam says the same breath that he says the new mitzvah called Ner Chanukah in Mikra Megillah. There's a new mitzvah of Yodayim, and there's a new mitzvah of Eruvin, and there's a new mitzvah of Tainis Tisha B'Av. And in fact, the same way that we pointed out in Shirish Aleph, that even though the Rambam's opinion is that Yodayim, the Netila of because the Rambam, if you look in Shirish Aleph, is talking Netilas Yodayim, and Netilas Yodayim was a separate takana with no basis at all. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah is not like that. The discussion of Yodayim in Avos HaTumas is not a discussion of Netilas Yodayim. It's a discussion of Tumas Yodayim, and a discussion of Netilas Yodayim is only in Chulin. So his discussion in Sefer HaMitzvos that Netilas Yodayim is Takana Shloimeh, which certainly nothing to do with Chulin, is non-existent in Mishnah Torah. And the same way the Rambam fell off that Yodayim is not a separate takana in Mishnah Torah, he also fell off in Mishnah Torah that Tainis Tisha B'Av is not a separate takana. So that's one possibility, that the mitzvah that the Rambam is ready to say that Tainis Tisha B'Av is a new mitzvah with no mandate, is only based on the Minyan HaKotzer and Sefer HaMitzvos, that the mitzvah is a mitzvah of Tkiyas Chatzeitzos, the calling out and the crying out, which the prelude to tshuva is not part of the mitzvah. It's only a time when you blow. So Memela, in that context, you can say that Tainis Tisha B'Av is a new mitzvah. In Mishnah Torah, it's non-existent because the mitzvah is chatzetzra, not only tkiyas chatzetzras, but it's za'oka and chatzetzras merging together. And in that sense, tiny eyes are part of it. That's why it says midivrei seifrim, and it's a prelude to tshuva. And the tiny eyes midivrei seifrim, which were midivrei kabbalah, which were added on later, are also part of this. So that's the simple way. There's another option. You could say that even in Mishnah Torah, it's a new mitzvah. Okay? Until this point, everything I said, I think is 100%, and it's certainly, B'chlal, I think, something that is roy, that the Rambam, it's roy to say in the Rambam. The next point, I'm saying with slight trepidation. Just before, I want to just add something to what he's saying in the Minyan HaKotzer in context of the Tisha B'Av is a separate mitzvah. Because the Ram says at the end of his discussion, he says at the end of the discussion in the Minyan HaKotzer, he says Kachol No'imrim, because he seems to say when the Nevi'im make a takana, and it's a new takana, there has to be something in Torah that it relates to, even though it's not it's not based and modeled after mitzvah Torah. He says Nevi'im in Bezdin tiknu v'tzivu likos Megillah v'inosa kedei lahaskei shvachos sha'atolish baruch hu u'tshua she'asa lanu v'yakova v'shavasenu kish levochu lahaloi k'dei lo'idi l'deus haboyim she'emes mashti chona b'Torah kimi goy gadol asher lo elikim koyv me'lov kashem elokeinu b'chol kleinu. That is Megillah. What would be Tisha B'Av? So I would say Tisha B'Av u'she'emes ma shehivtichona b'Torah of Teichochos and Klolos. We see in Tisha B'Av the Golus itself. And the inyan of Tainis Tisha B'Av is to mezarez the man to do tshuva and to end the golus. As the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva in Perek Zayin Halacha Hey, call Levi'im kulam tzivu al tshuva ve'en yisrael nigolim ela b'tshuva k'vayv ticha teira shesoif yisrael asas tshuva b'sef goluson u'miyad hein nigolim shnei v'hoya ki yovo elecha kol devo malel v'shafta Hashem elokecha v'shav Hashem elokecha. So this could also fit in to the same way he says at Mikra Megillah, even though it's no basis, but it somehow is based on Haftochas HaTeirah. Tisha B'Av is also based on Haftochas HaTeirah. Now I want to suggest that maybe Tisha B'Av could be a new mitzvah, even in Mishnah Torah. A priori, its borders on the fantastic. Why would one say such a thing? So I want to point out something. The Rambam did an amazing thing. Because what is the hallmark of Tainus in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tainus? The hallmark of Tainus, and it's coupled together with the mitzvah Za'akah. Because the mitzvah is Za'akah Lizraik. And together with the crying out, the Tainus augments man's understanding that he should be introspective and to do tshuva. interesting is, in the tiniest Midivre Kabbalah, is there Zaka or is there not Zaka? So the fact is that it is true. In Rambam, it's not there. Because listen to the Rambam again. Yesh shom yomim shekol Yisrael mis'anim behem ibnei atzarit shi'uru behem kidei la'oireh halavavos l'ftoich b'darkei tshuva. He has halacha beis that it's a prelude to tshuva. V'yezeh zichron l'ma'aseinu horoi v'maiseh avuseinu shoek ma'aseinu. But there's no zakah. He has the matola of the mitzvah of tainis, the mitzvah of chatzritzreis, but without the zakah. So in that context, I can imagine even in Mishnah Torah, it could be a new mitzvah. It is true, however, that the Geinim had zakah even on Tisha B'Av. And in context of that, I couldn't say what I'm saying. But the Rambam in Mishnah Torah is not like that. The Ritz Geis in Hilchos Tisha B'Av, Omud Lamed Aleph, V'oma ma rav paltoi, u'v'sisha b'av, tzorch l'meimar anenu u'slichois, t'legor mishat tainiyos ta'alma. In the Tesis Marzavitri, in Siman Reish Samach Vav, b'magentzia, oimim anenu b'tisha b'av, shachris u'mincha, v'af, not getting involved, whether it's the Yochel or the Tzibur, it's not an all issue. The Af Shomati Shebebavel Oimim Slichas B'Tisha B'Av B'Yeshiva. I'm not getting involved in the Rav's business that in Tisha B'Av there's some philosophy, that there's Avkor from Slichas. Could be that in the meaning of Chachmei Ashkenaz, that's it's only Kinas, no Slichas. Or the Maisa in the Geinim there was slichos, and in the Rambam there are absolutely no slichos. So even in Mishnah Torah, the relationship between Tisha B'Av and the mitzvah of Zakah is tenuous, and you can still even imagine in Mishnah Torah that it could be a new mitzvah. That was Nogeya to Tisha B'Av, Nogeya to Minyan HaMitzvos, a mitzvah which we discussed already. Now, let's get back here where we left off of Mitzvah Shem last week. We had a problem, if you recall. The Ram has a mitzvah of B'chor B'ei B'Tehira, and he originally was of the opinion that there's no Behemoth Torah, B'chor Behemoth Torah, Chutz La'aretz B'chlal. And then later he says that there is, but it's not Nikra. B'chor Eretz Yisrael is Nikra. We had a problem, and the Ram seems to say very clearly that B'chor Eretz Yisrael is Noyeg Bizman Hazeh. And we asked ourselves, Minchas Chinuch asked, Rebbeinu Shalom, the reason why Eretz Yisrael is different than Chutz La'aretz is because of Ma'aseh Sheni. And Ma'aseh Sheni depends upon Kedush Ha'aretz. And the Kedush Ha'aretz, L'gabe Trumas and Maasros, is only midrabanan, because you need Bias Kochem. As the Ram says in Perek Aleph V'chus Trumas. Ram says in Perek Aleph V'chus Trumas. At the end, Aloch Chavor. So the Minchas Chinuch, in fact, says B'chor Yisrael is like B'chor Chutz La'aretz, and there was no B'chor after Churban Nebuchadnezzar, because the Kiddush of Ezra was the Kiddush of Bias Kulchem. We lacked Bias Kulchem. So we pointed out that the Pasuk in Nehemiah clearly says that they brought B'chores, Behemoth Tehera, to Beis HaMikdash. They brought it to Beis HaMikdash. So if they brought it to Beis HaMikdash, you have to say that the B'chor, Behemoth Tehera was not. Are they going to say that it's Chum Bazar? What can I tell you? Okay, so that is what we have here. Okay, so we mentioned that the Malchesha says that Bias Kulchem is only a T'nai, and basically the Tush Oretz is complete, and therefore there's Ma'aseh Sheni, really, which is the Chasson of a T'nai, and therefore there's B'chor. That's Malchesha. So we said that the Rambam Shemitah B'Yovel, Chaim points out that Bias Kulchem is not Stam, it's a Chasson of Tush Oretz. That the Kedush Oretz is non-existent l'gabe Tchumus U'Maisas, and therefore there's going to be a new Kiddush in Bias Shlishis l'gabe Tchumus U'Maisas and l'gabe other things. That's what Chaim says and say. So we're left with an amazing problem. What exactly was B'cheres? How are they marked with B'cheres in Bias Sheni? So the first point which I want to point out to you is I think that there's a mistaken assumption over here. Because if you're talking about a Kedush Oretz and a Chesron and Bias Kulchem, you're focusing only on what's called Kivshu Oilei Mitzrayim ve'Oli Bovel. The Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchos Trumos, discusses the history of Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. And there were basically two Kedushas. The Kedusha of Oilei Mitzrayim, and whatever boundaries they had. And then when they came back to Ezra, it was less expansive, and what's called Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim ve'Oli Bovel. But there was an area on the outskirts which were Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim below Oilei Bovel. Okay. So the question is, we're talking about B'chor Eretz Yisrael. What area are we talking about? Are we talking about the area of Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim ve'Oli Bovel, where you can have a discussion of Mitzvah Tluyis V'Oretz? Or we're talking about even Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim below Oilei Bovel. So I think that it's very clear in the Rambam, because the Rambam says in Perek Aleph Hilchos Trumos in a very clear fashion that there are basically 5 areas in the world, and Eretz Yisrael consists of 2 areas: Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim v'Oilei Bovel, and Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim below Oilei Bovel. Then there's Syria, then there's Atzas Smuches, and the rest of Chutz La'aretz. So Rabbi Yisai, if the Rambam says that B'chor Eretz Yisrael is different than Chutz La'aretz, his B'chor in Eretz Yisrael is not limited to Kitshu Oilei Mitzrayim v'Oilei Bovel. It's even in the area which when the diaspora came and Ezra, leading diaspora, was not Mekadesh that area. But there is B'chor Eretz Yisrael in that area also. You get the impression that they're dinim over here, because the Rambam says the Peris Eretz Yisrael shorts l'chutzla, it's a pturim. And Peris Eretz Yisrael shorts l'chutzla means Peris of Oilei Mitzrayim V'olei Bovel, and also Peres of Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel. It means any Peres of Eretz Yisrael. It's a very strange thing. What is the area? What is the meaningfulness of this area of Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel? So the Rav, I recall, he pointed out that there certainly is a Shem Eretz Yisrael in Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel. It means that smicha, which is limited to Eretz Yisrael, is also good in Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel. Kiddush HaChodesh, Ibra Shonim, which is limited to Eretz Yisrael, is also in Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel. Smicha, which is in Eretz Yisrael, is in Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel. These are the examples he gave. I think he might have given a goof also. You can also talk about Lo Sechonim, Ram Luchs Avodah Zorah, that there's an Isa of Chaniah, of giving a Goy Chaniah in Eretz Yisrael, is also in Olei Mitzrayim v'Olei Bovel. So Ram is to Eretz Yisrael there. The din of Saf, the Halacha Moshe Sinai, from Safek Olo, in the Chutz La'aretz, the Chumrah, as opposed to the Eretz, a Chutz La'aretz, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael. In Olei Mitzrayim v'Olei Bovel, it's Eretz Yisrael. She had an amazing thing. What does it all mean? For example, I'll tell you, the Rav said over from the Zayda of Chaim, that what's the whole issue of Surya? Kibush Yochid, Shmei Kibush, Lav Shmei Kibush. What happened in Surya? Rabbeinu Shalom. The same way the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael was Boto, the Kedusha of Surya is Boto. So what difference does it make? It's ancient history. So Reb Chaim said that the nafkamina is that the Yushalmi in Shvius, Perek Vov, says v'heitivcho b'hirbucha me'avasecha, that if there was a kibush rishon, then the second kedusha could be chal through yeshiva without kibush. So in Surya, when there was no kibush, only yeshiva, where the Surya is like Eretz Yisrael, and that depends upon the issue of kibush yochid shmei kibush. I would go a step further, because what does it mean that there's a Shem Eretz Yisrael on Kivshu Olei Mitzrayim v'lo Olei Bovel? It means one thing, Rabbi say, that if there's a kibush rabim, and it's chal a kibush and a kiddush in Eretz Yisrael, even though the kedusha is boto, but the Shem Eretz Yisrael is not boto. If kibush yochid shmei kibush, then Surya would be Eretz Yisrael, and you have a Shem Eretz Yisrael. And the Rambam is very clear about this, that Surya is a separate area, not part of Eretz Yisrael. Because kibush yochid, lav shmei kibush, certain dinim like Eretz Yisrael, but midaraisa, it's nothing. Now, let's now look over here. And the Ram says an amazing thing over here. And the Ram says, at the end, when he adds our Bechor, in the end of this mitzvah, Mitzayin Tes, he says, Bein shehoya beis hamikdash bonul, bein shehoya chorev, and that the Bechor is noig, what he originally said, Eino noig el Beit Yisrael, bein shehoya beis hamikdash bonul, bein shehoya chorev, כמו שהוא עטו בזמננו זה, כמו מעשה דוגל. It's very clear that you can equate this to מעשה דוגל. There's no קדושה אורץ בכלל לגבי מעשה דוגל, even in כבשו אוהלי מצרים ואוהלי בבל. So with trepidation, this is the kasha over here. It's very clear. No one can deny it. The Ram doesn't deny it. There was Bechor in Eretz Yisrael. Even when there was a Kedusha of Ezra. Even after Churban Nebuchadnezzar, with Kedusha Eretz was Poka and never came back. At least in Trumas and Mises. I was wondering, maybe you can flip the whole discussion and say like the Malcheshes with a different twist and say basically the Shem Eretz Yisrael is Mechayiv in Trumas U'Maisres. The Kedusha Sa'oretz is just a T'nai. There's no difference whether it's Chosed, it has to show it's a Chosed Bias Kulchem, or there's no Kedusha Sa'oretz. So therefore, the Rambam is ready to say that all the areas that had a Kibush Rabbim on it, the Chayiv B'chor, Midraisa, and that B'chor is Nikrav, and if you makriv that B'chor in Chutz, if you do a Shechita on that B'chor, in Chutz La'oretz, B'zman Hazeh, you violate the Isa of Shchuti Chutz. That's what I was wondering. It's very radical, but frankly, I'm very confused. Not that I have any lies that you have to say it. It's very clear in the Rambam, his whole discussion of Eretz Yisrael points to this. But the question is it possible to say that the Kedusha Sa'oretz is only a T'nai and it's considered as Ma'aseh Dogma? Because if you recall, at this point, one thing I'm telling you, the problem in this is that Rab Chaim says, he says like this, in Hilchos Ma'aseh Sheni Perek Aleph Halacha Yudalid, Ulezeh Kosav Rambam Matam. The Rambam says there like this: Ma'aseh Sheni Hoil V'Ton Havos Mokum Emi Vinois Michutz La'oretz Ki B'chor Be'em Tmeya. Which is a very strange thing. The Rambam learns that B'chor Be'em Tmeya is not Noyeg because there is Ma'aseh Sheni, and then he says Emi Vin. We learn from Bechor to Ma'aseh Sheni, and we learn back. We learn from Ma'aseh Sheni to Bechor that there's no Bechor in Chutz La'oretz, so it's Kichulin. And then we learn from Bechor back to Ma'aseh Sheni, there's no Avodas Mokel and Ma'aseh Sheni Chutz La'oretz. L'fikach lo chivu lahafresh Ma'aseh Sheni b'Suya. So Chaim is like this. The whole Suya Dina Ke'eretz Yisrael Medivreim Hu Rak Le'inyan Mitzvos Hatluyis Ba'oretz De'enu Noigis Ele Be'eretz Yisrael Midrabonon. It's like Eretz Yisrael for Mitzvos Hatluyis Ba'oretz. U'bezehu de'osu Suya Ke'eretz Yisrael. You have to be mafish Trumas U'Maisel L'chayva Medivreim. Ma she'en kein Le'inyan Hach Dina. The eno bo michutz la'oretz lo nishtanis suya. V'al hu k'chutz la'oretz kedin Torah. Suya in havos mokom is chutz la'oretz. Umishum hochi hu de nishtanu ma'aseh sheni misham mitzvus ba'oretz the eno noeg b'suya. Then he says like this. And he says like this. The bezeh harisu yeshav lechutz la'aretz kmo shenizboyer. It comes out that the two dinim is a din havo as a din a mitzvah tulis la'aretz. And this Rab Chaim says, let me read this. 1 second. Then he says like this, V'nira, the shnei dinim heim, in Perek Avol Chiyud Dalet. Die Achre, die afinen bechol mi meise sheni, deino bo mechutz la'aretz, und the schadish dim mesume bechol chutz la'aretz, deino bar habo mechutz la'aretz. Shuv iskish gam meise sheni lebechol. The meise sheni shechutz la'aretz eino bar habo. This is the important part. V'nimsa the shnei dinim heim b'ma'as sheni, meise sheni. Chada, the eino noiheg klal meise sheni bechutz la'aretz. The harehu mi mitzvah tluyis ba'aretz deinu noigis ela ba'aretz the oid the afilu im hoyinu moitze meise sheni shechutz la'aretz have yadin deinu ba'havo mechutz la'aretz kibachor v'lo tikshe di eich shaykh lemelech zeh meise sheni bachor. So what happens is that bachor is hookish to the Maaseh Sheni of the Mitzvah Tluis Ba'aretz. And Maaseh Sheni is hookish to Bechor afterwards as far as Abba. So it comes out according to Rab Chaim that the whole basis of the discussion over here about Maaseh Sheni is not about the Maaseh Sheni, which that you're learning, you're deriving Bechor from Maaseh Sheni. It's not about the Maaseh Sheni of Hava. That's only in the second rung, the second tier, that after we know that Bechor is part of Chutz La'aretz, we say there's no Maaseh, there's no Hava in Maaseh Sheni. But Bechor itself, you learn from the Maaseh Sheni Mitzvah Tluis Ba'aretz. And according to Rab Chaim, you have absolutely nothing, because there's no K'tush La'aretz. This is what I was wondering, that maybe as far as the Hekesh is concerned, that Maaseh Sheni, as far as the Hekesh is concerned, that Maaseh Sheni is be'etzim and Shem Eretz Yisrael is chayiv. It's just choser tonight. Then we can begin to understand this. If not, you have to say tzorach and go. Now, next, mitzvah pay. HaMitzvah, HaMashlima Shmoinim, He shezivonu liftois b'chol odom. Do you have to be paid b'chol odom? Or she'itein hadom mohem, you do a pidyon, and you give these domim that make pidyon l'koyim. V'omer yis'aleh b'chol bonecha titenli. B'chol bonecha, you should give the b'chol bonecha titenli takodesh baruch hu. B'chol bonecha titenli. So this is a priori a very peculiar pasuk. What does it mean, b'chol bonecha titenli? So the Ram continues. Ubei elonu hanesina hazeis eich tiyeh. And the Torah continues and explains to us how this nesina happens. Vuhu, listen to this. Shenifdenu min hakohen. We should be paid the bechor from the kohen. And this is something very serious. And then he says, Uki'ilu, it's not a drasha. He's saying, Pshat, what the Titenli is. That you learn out from Ach Podoi Siftes B'chol Odom that explains what the Titenli. Ukilu hu kvar zochaboy, kain dvachu zochaboy. That the kain is zeiche in the ben before the pidyon. V'niknehu mimenu b'chamisha sloim. And the father is kaina the son back with the chamisha sloim. There's a two-step process. First of all, titenli, that the bechor is takatitenli, that the bechor is shalakayin. And then we take the Dmei Pidyon, and we say, here is the Dmei Pidyon, and we give it to the kohen, not as a nesina matnes kuhuna, but it's a Dmei Kinyan. V'niknehu mimenu b'chamisha sloim. V'omo yis'al le'ach podoi sifte es b'chor odom. The b'chor sifte explains how the titenli is. That's what I'm saying. That it's obey elonu hanesina azeich echtiyeh. V'hu shenifdeu min hakoyen uki'ilu hu kvar zochaboy v'nikneu mimenu b'chamisha sloim. V'omo yis'al le'ach podoi sifte es b'chor odom. U'mitzvah zu hi mitzvah's pidyon haben. And this is the Ram's Chiddush that b'chor, it's ki'ilu that the kohen is zeicha before the pidyon. And this you find in the Kadmonim, Hagos Mordechai, Meseches Yevamos, Perek Asi, Remes Kuf Chav Zayin. V'hei say the pidyon, Yesh Nogim, Lohosim, Hana'ar, B'chekel Shel Kohen Mitchila, Kedem HaBrocha. So I would tell you the pshat is that to say that it's the kohen's, B'chor Bonecha Titenli. Shuvas Marivail in Simon Kuf Peites, also from the Kadmonim, Mo'av Yikach Haben, V'yitnu l'kohen b'matona, Marivail, U'b'loshen Zeh Yoyme, B'ni Zeh Ploni, Asher Yoda L'ishti, B'chiroi, B'chiri hu li'imoi, Yehei shelacha, v'yitnu l'kohen. It's an amazing thing. And that's why, however, it's a two-tier process. It's ki'ilu, it shall kohen, and then there's a pidyon with a haknah. And it could be, that's what the Tumas Adeshin, the Psokim, and Iksovim, Siman Reish Lamed Hey, says the following. Ach, Masha Kasafta, Dim Hoya Noisein Habein, Lakoyein, Hoya Yoitze Bakach, Kamoy Bepeta Chamo, Badusi Do. This should not be allowed in the base measures because the two-step process. There's one. The process is one is in the scene that in the scene of the kohen and a pidyon with the hakno. In fact, the achreinim, I found one of the achreinim, so a tshuva sefer l'hoiris nasa. He says the muvum is the scene is chamesh shloim the kohen the pidyon haben enu doim the scene shamat neskuhuna. The honey ain't on elematono shenois the lekayin. The ain't a kohen soch litain tmuasam klum. Avol dmei pidyon haben niten lekayin tmuas haben. The kiva de omatera b'chol bonecha titain li lechein koydem apidyon nechshav haben lekinyono shel kohen ועדי שאב נויסן דמי פדיון, לכהן הרי הוא כהן ממנו הסבן בחמש שלוים זה. I was wondering if this is correct. Maybe this is the reason why there's a chiv achayis. The hafrosha of the chamesh loyim, that the mitzvah pidyon haben is not the pidyon, but nikneu min hakohen. And if you don't give the kesef after you say this is dmei tmura and it doesn't get to the kohen's hand, you didn't do anything, because the mitzvah is to be paid there and to be kena with the main pidyon. Okay. Now, next. Mitzvah pei aleph. Ba mitzvah achas u'shmoinim hi shetzivonu liftois petach hamo b'seh. I'm not getting involved in the next sentence, half of the sentence, because there's a question in Madur Kama, Madur Basra, whether there was pidyon b'shovi or not. V'nosein oisei haseh l'koyin. V'hu amur yis'aleh ufetach hamo tifte b'seh. If you look at mitzvah pei aleph, and you look at mitzvah pei pei, and you compare the lashon, if you ask, is it true in petach hamo that it's ki'ilu shel kohen and the Yisrael is buying it back for the kohen? Or petach hamo is like matnas kuna in general, is a pidyon and a matnas kuna. The lashon over here, if you read it, does not sound like pidyon haben. He doesn't say nikneu and be a Torah and the sin azeich ech sheyeh. It's a poshita shetzivo liftes petach hamo, and to give this to the kohen. It's very possible because of that. That there's no, we paskin, no chiv achayis, because there's no hekesh. The b'chol behemet tehira, the Mishnah, according to one Tana, we paskin like the first peg of b'chayres. It is true. I'd like to read this to you. However, the chinuch doesn't go like this. If you look in Sefer Chinuch, in Mitzvah Chav Beis, Liftois Vlad Chamo, Zocho Shenolad Rishon V'chulei, V'inyon hu Shelokech Yisrael Se Echod, V'noisnei L'koyen B'pidyon B'chor HaChamo, and this B'chor HaChamo, Shehu L'Hashem Yisborach Min HaTam Shekasavno L'mayla, V'hu Baruch Hu Nosno L'koyen, U'Lefikach Peideo Yisrael Mimenu. This chinuch, his lashon by petach hamo, sounds very much like the Ram's lashon by pidyon haben, and also the Murtal Gazi, he holds like the Sefer Chinuch. His lashon is mashma like that. And Hilchos B'choros, Perek Aleph, Daf Chesed Beis, the first Vilna Ois Yud Gimel, which is an amazing thing. What I'd like to show you, and that I think is the important point here, that a priori in the lashon, the Ram over here, it's very clear that b'chol be'emet tehira and pidyon petach hamo cholok be'etzem yisrael diva. Interesting also in the Rambam is in the Madur Kama, he says, HaMitzvah ha'achas u'shmoinim yitzivonu liftois petach hamo b'seh levad u'shelo yifte b'zulasa. It means there's no pidyon medamim. He was chayzer both in Pirush Mishnayis, Madur Basra, and Madur Kama is also like that. Madur Basra, and here he was Magia, the Sefer Mitzvah itself, and he knocked out the word of Shaloi, and it says, V'im lo Im lo yifte bezulasa. So you have the option of dummy. Now, here, the question is, you see, if you read it, you see, you get the impression HaMitzvah achas ushmonim hi shetzivoro liftos petach hamo b'sel levad im lo yifte bezulosai. So it means, what's the first thing in Madua Basra? To be paid with Shavuot. And if you're not paid with Shavuot, you should give the seh. Okay? And the opinion of the seh is not if you don't do Shavuot. That's what it's mashma here. In Madua Basra, in Pirush Mishnah, is mashma the equal options that seh and Shavuot are both l'chatchila. And he adds the word in Perek Aleph B'chos Mishnah Hey, which was not Madua Kamo, V'da Shimrotza Liftos Petach Hamo B'Shavuot L'Ashoyu B'Kach V'Lo Nema B'Seh Elo L'Hokolov. He has two options. It can either be this or that. B'Seh Elo L'Hokolov. But the Pashas, the Shas, and the Gemara is mashma that the Ika Pidyon Aben is B'Seh. And the Pidyon B'Shavuot is only if he doesn't have a seh. The Gemara B'chos Yud Aleph on Aleph, Omer Reb Yitzchak, Omer Reish Lakish, Mi Sheish Lo Petach Hamo V'Ein Lo Seh L'Ftoisei Peideyu B'Shavuot. So if he doesn't have a seh, then he's paid the B'Shavuot. El afilu Temer Reb Yehuda Lo Yehei Chomo Min HaHektish V'Lo Yom Motera B'Seh Lahachmir Olav El Lahokol Olav. So, lahachmir lov el lahokol lov. See, Pashas is explaining what happened before, and what he said before. It's only another option if he doesn't have a seh. The Gemara is turning around, and it says lahachmir lahokol lov, and the ikah is you should give your Shavuot. It's a chiddush. Here, it's mashma that the Ika is, it's very strange, like a 180-degree turn, because the Chatchili started out that there's no mitzvah of Shavuot. And the way he makes the Hagor, im lo yifteh bezulasai, it goes out just the opposite. The Ika mitzvah is b'Shavuot. Very strange. Okay? Now, HaMitzvah Hashtayim Ushmonim Hichizivono Be'arifas Petach Hamo Im Lo Nirtze Liftoisef. We don't want to do a pidyon, then we do Arifa. V'omer Yis'al V'im Lo Yisifte V'arafte U'kva Yisboi Mishtei Mitzvazu Gam Kein Bebechodes. So Mitzvah Hashem, next week I want to focus on V'yesh l'maksha shiaksho alai v'yoyma le'eze dobo manisa p'diyos of arifos b'shtei mitzvahs. Why should it be two mitzvahs? P'diyat arif v'loy manisa oisa mitzvah achas? Because this is shorish shvi. That it's two ways to makayim the mitzvah. There's a mitzvah called petach hamo. You gotta do pidyon or arifa, and it should be one mitzvah. And Mitzvah Hashem will deal with this. Mitzvah Hashem next week, bli neder. Sh'ol bi zeichet Yeshuas v'nechamos.